The sun descended upon the city in a final burst of orange and gold, casting its light over the usually quiet suburban street. For Henry Walker, it seemed like just another ordinary day. An 81-year-old man with a stooped back and gray hair, living alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. Once a special forces soldier, Henry carried with him the history of silent missions and fierce battles in distant borderlands. But all glory had receded into the past. All that remained was him, his faded army jacket, and memories that still flickered in his mind every night. Henry didn't like noise. He often chose small streets, quiet tree-lined paths, avoiding the modern hustle and bustle of a city that changed daily. That afternoon, Henry decided to treat himself to some peace in the small park at the end of the street. He stepped into the convenience store, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up a packet of tea and a roll of medical tape. An old habit, as an old leg injury occasionally flared up. The young female cashier smiled faintly when she saw him, and Henry just nodded slightly, murmuring a thank you. Leaving the store, he slowly shuffled along, his worn military boots tapping softly against the sun-dappled pavement. The wind carried the scent of coffee and the lively chatter from the cafe just across the street. It was a popular cafe, packed every afternoon with stylish young people. Motorcycles parked bumper to bumper from the entrance to the sidewalk. Henry usually paid them no mind. To him, youth was something beautiful but luxurious. He just longed for peace. But fate chose him for a different kind of moment. As he squeezed past the line of motorcycles, his worn cane unexpectedly brushed against the bright orange backpack of a blonde-haired young man in the biker group. The impact wasn't loud, just enough to send a soda can rolling onto the sidewalk. Henry, with the reflexes of someone who had lived through battles, immediately stopped. He bent down to pick up the can, his mouth stammering, "I'm sorry, son, I was careless." One might have thought that was the end of it, but before he could even straighten up, heavy footsteps approached. Mike, the largest in the group, with heavily tattooed arms and eyes like a disturbed wild animal, lunged forward. "Watch where you're going, old man." The cold voice hadn't even faded before a powerful arm shoved Henry's shoulder. Everything happened in an instant. Old Henry no longer had the strength to maintain his balance. His thin frame toppled onto the cold stone pavement. The tea packet and bandage roll flew out, his cane rolling to the leg of a nearby table. Blood seeped from his freshly scraped knee, soaking through the faded khaki fabric. The physical pain was nothing compared to the shame and shock that overwhelmed him. Henry looked up, his eyes meeting countless faces, but no one truly looked at him. A young waitress, her eyes hesitant, finally turned her back and re-entered the cafe, avoiding any trouble. The young patrons, laughing and chatting, merely glanced past him as if he were a shadow, an invisible object. Someone scoffed, "Must be a senile old man." Henry struggled to push himself up. His wrinkled, veined hands trembled as he picked up his cane, blood dripping from his knee, leaving dark red spots on the dusty cement. He didn't complain, didn't get angry, just silently slumped down, his head bowed low as if he wished to disappear from this world. His old cloudy eyes flickered with a melancholic glint, his loneliness suddenly overwhelming amidst the sea of indifferent people. Mike returned to his group laughing heartily, recounting his new triumph like a joke. "Clumsy old man, can't even walk straight." Laughter echoed in response. Someone pulled out their phone to record Henry struggling to get up, not to help, but merely for social media entertainment. At that moment, Henry felt as if all eyes on the street avoided him. No one reached out to help him up. No one asked if he was all right. It seemed he was just a silent shadow in a changing city, left behind by the hurried lives of the young. Henry checked his knee. Blood was still seeping, but he paid it little mind. The true pain lay deep within. He picked up his tea packet and bandage roll, quickly wiped off the dirt, then leaned on his cane and stood, walking towards a stone park bench. Each step became heavy, not only with age but with the invisible coldness that enveloped him. On the bench, Henry sat panting, his eyes gazing distantly toward the fading sunset behind the trees. All the hustle and bustle seemed separated by a glass wall. The cool evening breeze brushed through his hair, bringing a sensation both biting and chilling. He unwrapped the bandage, trying to dress the wound with trembling hands. In the dim light, the injury was clear on his wrinkled skin. No one was beside him. No comrades, no shouts of, "Keep going!" Only his sighs merging with the wind rustling through the leaves. In a corner of the city, these faint sounds were nothing amidst the clamor. But for Henry, it was the moment he realized that the battlefields of old might have been brutal, but the battlefield of loneliness and coldness within human hearts was infinitely more haunting and painful. And at that very moment, everything in his life was about to take a completely different turn, one that Henry himself could never have expected. Henry huddled on the old stone bench, his withered hands struggling to re-bandage his bleeding knee. His eyes watched the stream of people passing by, an endless flow of the modern city. Each person carried their own world. Phones, headphones, laughter, hurried glances. They drifted past him as if he were part of the scenery, an anonymous blur in the bustling streets. No one stopped, no one asked, though occasionally glances darted past, full of awkwardness, then quickly disappeared. Henry felt as if he had become invisible. In a distant memory, he recalled those nights guarding the border years ago, where even a small sound would make the whole squad spring to action, standing shoulder to shoulder, protecting each other. Now, in the peaceful rear, a fallen veteran went unnoticed. A young couple walked past arm in arm. The girl looked at him for a few seconds, then whispered something in her boyfriend's ear. The boyfriend merely shrugged. Probably just another drunk old man. Then both hurried away. In the distance, the group of young men remained boisterous, music from their Bluetooth speaker echoing across the street corner. Mike laughed gleefully as he recounted as if the shove was a proud achievement. His friends cheered him on, and a few others filmed with their phones, the short video already uploaded online with a sarcastic title. Henry looked up at the empty sky, a compounding sense of humiliation and helplessness. He wasn't the type to beg or complain. A soldier's life had forged his resilience, but the coldness of indifference was more chilling than the night wind at the border. In his ears, the laughter, car horns, the screech of motorcycle tires, all a chaotic symphony where he was a forgotten, silent note. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind swept through, snatching a note from Henry's pocket to the ground. He bent down to pick it up, his hand trembling from the cold and a pang of melancholy. The note contained an old address where he used to meet his comrades. Now he was alone on this bench. A brown-haired boy kicked a soccer ball that rolled nearby. He stopped looking at Henry with a hesitant gaze, but then a call from his mother echoed, "Ethan, hurry up, darling. Don't bother strangers." The boy quickly picked up the ball and ran off, without looking back. Henry sat motionless, clutching his cane. He felt as though he had aged 10 years in that instant. The place that was once his sacred homeland in his heart had now become a strange city, where everyone lived only for themselves, and a veteran sitting and bandaging his wounds was merely a silent shadow. Nobody remembered, nobody knew his name, but in that silence, deep down, something still smoldered, an old flame not easily extinguished. And no one knew that in just a few minutes, this entire street corner would be shaken by something no one had ever witnessed. Just a few minutes after Henry sat quietly, a dull thud echoed on the quiet street, the heavy sound of a pickup truck engine slamming on its brakes in front of the cafe. The curious crowd turned their heads. The car door opened, and out stepped a tall man in plain clothes, his eyes sharp and his stride resolute. It was Captain Daniel Brooks, Emily's uncle, who had just received an urgent call from his niece. No one noticed Emily standing hidden behind the tree, her hands tightly clasped in anxiety. Captain Brooks swept his gaze across the noisy group of bikers in front of the cafe, then headed straight for Henry, who was still sitting alone, blood staining his trousers and a thin trail of blood stretching on the sidewalk. Without a moment's hesitation, Captain Brooks strode through the stunned glances, moving directly towards Mike and his friends. "Which one of you just touched him?" His voice rang out, sharp and low but full of authority, making the entire group freeze. Mike tried to maintain his arrogant demeanor, shrugging as he replied, "The old man just dropped his stuff and fell. What's the big deal?" His friends behind him nodded in agreement, but Captain Brooks didn't take his eyes off Mike, reaching into his jacket pocket to pull out a shining badge, holding it out in front of him. The atmosphere around the biker group suddenly thickened, and all laughter instantly died. Outside, a few passers-by started filming, whispering to each other, "Looks like a cop. What's going on? So tense?" The afternoon street seemed to halt, all sounds giving way to an indescribable tension. Emily quickly approached Henry, quietly asking, "Are you in a lot of pain?" "I called Uncle Brooks." At this moment, Captain Brooks turned to Henry, his gaze softening slightly. "I'm sorry, I'm late." He bent down, checked the wound, and gently placed a hand on Henry's shoulder, his eyes filled with respect. Turning back to Mike, Captain Brooks sternly stated, "This is a veteran of this city. Do you know what he did for this country?" Mike tried to argue, but Brooks' gaze seemed to penetrate everything. Not the authority of a police officer, but the uncompromising protection of someone who had fought on the battlefield. In just a moment, two patrol officers from the local police precinct appeared, along with a small ambulance. They received orders from Captain Brooks instructing them to check the cameras in front of the cafe and gather statements from witnesses. The crowd fell silent, all eyes fixed on the biker group. Mike's hands began to tremble. He stepped back, looking at his friends as if pleading for help, but no one spoke. The silence now was entirely different from before. Not indifference, but an anticipation of justice speaking. The heavy atmosphere lingered until Captain Brooks gently said to Henry, "You won't have to endure this alone." The afternoon street fell quiet, with only the siren of the ambulance and the sounds of phone cameras recording the moment an old and frail man was finally protected. No longer a silent shadow, but a living soul of this city. As the ambulance left the sidewalk, Henry was helped into the vehicle by the paramedics for first aid, but he only emphasized, "I'm fine, just a scratch." To him, that small wound was nothing compared to the cut in his heart when the whole city had turned its back on him. But this time, Henry was not alone. Captain Brooks remained at the scene, his gaze fixed on the biker group. Mike stood hunched, his tattooed hands visibly trembling, his eyes now devoid of their former aggression, replaced by confusion and shame. His friends also remained silent, no one daring to act arrogant anymore. Around them, the crowd grew larger. Everyone was silent, not daring to approach, only observing. But this time, it was an observation of awakened conscience. A middle-aged woman, the cafe owner, who had been sitting quietly at the counter all this time, suddenly stepped outside. In her hand, she held a clean cotton towel. Without a word, she gently approached Henry, wiping away the remaining blood on his knee as the ambulance drove off. "I'm so sorry, I should have come out sooner." Her voice trembled with remorse. Henry looked at her, nodding slightly in forgiveness. At the corner of the street, Emily, the young girl who had called Captain Brooks, walked over to Mike. Without any hesitation, she spoke clearly in front of everyone. "Do you think a mere apology is enough? He lived his whole life for this country. You owe him, and this entire city, something far greater." Her words resonated like a wake-up call. A high school student standing nearby hesitated, then stepped forward, placing a small tissue and a bottle of water in Henry's hand. "Thank you, sir, for what you've done." A ripple effect began. The old newspaper vendor from the alley, usually distant, now quietly ran over with a bouquet of white chrysanthemums. A group of elderly people, sitting in the park opposite, formed a neat line, standing at military attention facing Henry. The entire street suddenly fell silent. Then one by one, both old and young, approached him. Not boisterously, not hurriedly, but full of meaning. Each offered a gesture, a handshake, a nod, a silent thank you. At its peak, as the precinct patrol team took Mike and his friends to the station to clarify the incident, Mike looked back at the crowd surrounding Henry. In his eyes, for the first time, something resembling both regret and envy appeared. Envy for a respect he had never understood, now suddenly realizing its meaning. Captain Brooks said nothing more to Mike, but when he turned to Henry, he gently gripped the old man's hand, softly saying, "We won't let this go unheard. Rest assured." That evening, a video of the incident spread across social media. But this time, it wasn't mocking clips, but images of every glance, every hand, every shared embrace, and the community's support for Henry. Hundreds of comments were written under the video. "I'm sorry for once being indifferent. This is the real America. I want to bring my children to meet this old man so they can learn about gratitude and kindness. That very night, a spontaneous online group organized a gathering in the park where Henry had sat to honor elderly veterans. The next morning, when Henry returned to the park, he was stunned to see a whole group of young people standing in lines on both sides of the entrance, each holding a small flag and a warm smile. A child even ran up and hugged his leg, looking up and asking, "Grandpa, did you ever save anyone?" Henry paused, moved, before finally being able to say, "Yes, I saved many people, but today, I was saved by everyone here." Immediately after, the ward and the Veterans Association, in coordination with schools, invited Henry onto a small stage in the square. The whole city fell silent when he appeared, not with pride, but simply in his old army jacket. He spoke of his years of fighting, of the biting cold on the front lines, of camaraderie, and especially of his greatest fear, being forgotten, being met with indifference. In the audience, Mike was allowed to attend as someone who needed to atone. Looking up at the stage, his eyes were red. When the program ended, he quietly approached Henry, knelt down and said, "I was wrong. Please give me a chance to make amends." Henry said nothing, only placed a hand on Mike's shoulder, his eyes filled with forgiveness and hope. Henry's story quickly became the pride of the entire city. The cafe where the incident occurred put up a sign honoring veterans and also launched an annual appreciation day. Meanwhile, Mike actively participated in volunteer programs, caring for the elderly, providing free tutoring to poor children. He wanted to use actions to regain the respect he had lost. Henry, from a solitary old man, now became a living symbol of compassion and community strength. His smile each evening as he walked through the park began to spread, like a positive energy, healing even the most indifferent souls. And then, that same city, which had once turned its back on a fallen old man, together erected a small monument in front of the park, engraved with Henry Walker's name and the words, "This place was once indifferent, but from here, gratitude was awakened." Henry looked up at the stone monument, no tears falling, but his eyes sparkling with happiness. He knew that no one would be forgotten in this city anymore. And most importantly, true respect, once restored, would spread far and wide forever. Night descended upon the city like a gentle blanket, soothing the scratches of a turbulent day. Henry returned to his small apartment, but his mind was still flooded with emotion. The biting cold outside his window now seemed warmer. From deep within, he realized he was no longer alone. In the park, where just a few hours earlier had been a place of indifference, now glowed with the tiny lights lit by young people themselves. Emily and her friends decided to stay all night, arranging plastic chairs in a circle, each bringing a small memento, a thank you letter, an old photo of Henry when he was young, a self-drawn picture for him, as if to offer belated gratitude. A young family brought a guitar, quietly singing Amazing Grace, their voices echoing in the night, blending with the wind as if comforting souls once veiled by the darkness of indifference. The old, formerly gruff newspaper vendor now brought a thermos of hot tea, patiently pouring for everyone. Mike, having just left the police station, quietly returned to the park. He hesitated, his remorseful eyes not daring to meet Henry's gaze. Standing at the edge of the light, Mike lingered, finally gathering the courage to approach, quietly sitting down beside the old man. He said nothing, only silently offered a box of fresh bandages and a bottle of antiseptic. Henry looked at Mike for a long time, then gently smiled. The atmosphere paused for a beat, as if the entire park held its breath, witnessing the moment a young man willingly stepped across the boundary of fear and remorse towards true kindness. Emily poured more tea, and everyone took turns sharing small stories about relatives who were soldiers, about family memories, about gratitude, and about times they almost forgot a kind deed. Under the night sky, individual feelings gradually opened up. Layers of indifference peeled away, returning to each person the empathy and warmth inherent in a community. That night, Henry returned home feeling no longer cold. On his table, he found a letter from an unknown boy. "Thank you for teaching me how to stand up for the weak." He looked up at the dark sky outside his window, seeing the stars seemingly smiling too. The indifference in the heart of the city had been healed. Not by a miracle, but by a night of spreading compassion and by the strength of hearts that had learned to reconnect. A few days later, early winter chills settled in, making the whole city seem to withdraw. Henry Walker was meticulously wiping his faded army jacket, the jacket that had accompanied him through countless rains, suns, and the upheavals of a soldier's life. Suddenly, a soft but resolute knock sounded at the door. He opened it, and there was Mike, the young man who had pushed him down on the sidewalk that afternoon. Mike stood there looking completely different, no longer bearing any of the arrogance of those first days, only a young man with disheveled hair and deep-set eyes from lack of sleep. In Mike's hand was a stack of papers, a volunteer application to help the local veterans center. The cold wind blew through the doorway, and Mike slightly bowed his head, his voice choked. I didn't come to make excuses. I just want to apologize. This is a volunteer application. I'll do anything. Clean, carry, care, just to help and learn to be a better person. Henry remained silent for a long time. In his old eyes, the light of experience, tolerance, and patience made Mike even more ashamed. He gently placed a hand on Mike's shoulder, his gaze soft, without judgment. Growth doesn't come from what you say, but from what you do, and especially from how you face your mistakes. Henry paused, then continued, Everyone falls. The question is how you choose to get up after falling. Mike looked up, his eyes moist. Behind him, the corridor was deserted, only the faint sound of wind whistling through the window crack. In a corner of the room, the old jacket hung quietly, casting a shadow on the wall, like a witness to generations who had fallen and then risen again. Henry opened the door and invited Mike in. They sat facing each other at a simple tea table. On the table, besides 2 cups of tea, there was also a letter from an old veteran, someone Mike had never met but whom Henry had helped. He told Mike about his days in the unit, about the fallen friends whose names no one knew, about the cost of silence and the power of forgiveness. Mike listened in silence. Every word Henry spoke,